Welcome back to Cryptic Creatures, the show where I give you the inside scoop on the details of a specific creature from mythology, folklore, cryptozoology, or literature. I'm your host, local monster nerd, and deranged mutant killer monster snow goon sculptor, Mothmancha. It's cold out there, y'all. Now, I did have a couple of ideas of where I wanted to take episode 5, and I figured a cold weather creature would be best given the time of year that I'm filming this. I also recognize that I've never been as far east as Japan when covering a monster yet. And, admittedly, I didn't know a lot about yokai before recording this episode in the first place, beyond the little anime I've seen surrounding it and its influences on the Pokemon franchise. I also haven't done a properly humanoid monster yet. So I figured this would be a really good opportunity for me to follow up on all 3 of these points of interest in a single episode. Imagine, if you will, that you are walking up a mountain trail in winter. The weather, which up to this point has been a light dusting of snow, begins to pick up as you're hit with a blast of icy air. The snow gets heavier, going from flurries to a full-on blizzard as you now trudge through the snow. You can barely see in front of you, and despite being decked out in snow gear, you are positively freezing. You glimpse a being in the distance, but only barely, as the only thing that you can easily see is a head of long, dark hair. The woman before you gazes into your eyes with piercing intensity, stopping you in her tracks with fear despite her immense beauty. As she approaches, she leans her head in for what seems to be a kiss, but you feel is something much more sinister. You feel her breath on your lips as something colder than the entire world around you, and your consciousness begins to fade, and you feel yourself begin to freeze as your life force leaves your body. Let's talk about the yuki-onna. Before we talk about the yuki-onna, we should probably actually address what a yokai is in the first place, which is sort of a difficult thing to parse out. Yokai is a term that doesn't have a specific translation, that is simply describing them as Japanese ghosts and demons and monsters doesn't really cut it. That's the gist of what they are, but yokai, at least to me, feels like a vibes-based catch-all. It's like how dinner can mean steak and potatoes and beans, or it can mean 5.5 Taco Bell Supreme Crunchy Tacos, or it can mean a line of ketamine in a black coffee. The word is very unique, and honestly, it's best left untranslated. Now, technically, you could take the word yokai and use it to mean any creature or spirit or demon or supernatural anything in about any part of the world. Mothman, in a technical sense, is a yokai. Casper the Friendly Ghost, Casper the Friendly Yokai. Supernatural, that's a show about yokai. Has-Been Hotel, well, you get the picture. Obviously, though, the most common usage of the word specifically refers to spirits, monsters, and other supernatural creatures from Japan. But an important distinction for us to make is that yokai are creatures that are not worshipped. Those would fall under the distinction of kami rather than yokai. Consider kami and yokai 2 halves of the same category, with kami being worshipped and yokai not being worshipped. That being said, even if you're not well versed in Japanese folklore or culture, or Japanese yourself, you're probably familiar with at least one yokai, although you might not know it. A kitsune, the shape-shifting multi-tailed fox, is a yokai that's also a popular TTRPG race. Oni, Japanese demon ogre trolls, are yokai that you might be familiar with from, at the very least, this emoji that is commonly referred to as the ogre emoji, or perhaps from the killer from Dead by Daylight. The tanuki, the Japanese raccoon dog, also known as that one critter with the huge balls, or the one Mario fursuit, also has a pretty heavy association with yokai. It is a trickster creature that takes the form of the tanuki. Also, a huge portion of Pokemon are inspired by various yokai. To name a few, there's
Dusclops, Drowsy, Scyther, Bronzor, Ho-Oh, Grimer, Muck, and Executor, Mismagius, Golem, Swalot, Ghastly, Gligar, Spidops, Nuzleaf, Shiftry, Frostlass, Lickitung, Snorunt, Mawile, Sentret, Vulpix, Sneasel, Weavile, Ninetales, Dunsparce, Espeon, Stakataka, Absol, Meowstick, Grippon.
Hopefully that kind of clears things up before we go into the episode proper. They are very much their own cultural category. The Yuki-onna's name is fairly simple. The name itself is written in kanji, Yuki means snow and onna means woman, giving us, well, snow woman. However, she does go by other names occasionally, given that there are so many permutations of this specific story, and some of these include yuki-onba, which means snow nanny, yuki-musume, meaning snow daughter, yukihime, meaning snow princess, and yukijorō, meaning, well, snow prostitute. There are more, of course, but they all follow the same pattern of being yuki, snow, and then some other word for a woman. The last thing I'll mention here is that I found a handful of creatures that are often lumped in with the yuki-onna that have similar names but are probably different yokai. There's a lot of confusion on whether they are or not, but based on the research I've done, I have grown to believe that they are slightly different things and slightly different versions of each myth. Some of these yokai include the tsurara-onna, the icicle woman, and the yukinba, the snow hag. Some might also consider the yuki-onba, as mentioned before, to be a different legend, as it references a specific story, but as I'm about to show you, stories of the yuki-onna all paint very different pictures of the spirit. As with many of these monsters, the yuki-onna varies quite a lot in description between various tales. The most common description seems to be a woman with ghostly pale skin, long black hair, and icy blue lips. Her pale skin helps her blend into the environment, particularly well paired with what usually is a kimono, specifically a lighter summer kimono, usually in a shade of white. More rarely, some tales will describe her as nude, only standing out in the snow at all because of her dark hair. She also, in most stories, is incredibly beautiful, almost unsettlingly, terrifyingly so, like the White Witch from Chronicles of Narnia, Lady Dimitrescu, or that f***ing fish from Shark Tale. Much more rarely, however, she is depicted with a older, almost hag-like appearance, like the Queen/Witch from Snow White, Yubaba from Spirited Away, or that f***ing fish from Shark Tale. Yuki-onna is also said to never leave footprints in the snow at all, meaning that her appearances end with her vanishing without a trace. Sometimes she simply floats shoelessly over the snow, and sometimes, like many other Japanese spirits, she has no feet. Her skin is cold to the touch, and her breath is even colder. Ability-wise, Yuki-onna have a fairly simple set of abilities. They're vampiric in nature, luring travelers in with their beauty, and then siphoning their force out of their mouths like a dementor, but hot. So like a dementor. They, also like in some vampire stories, can turn into a cloud of gas to escape, in this case specifically a flurry of snow, allowing the Yuki-onna to come and go as she pleases in the icy wilderness. Finally, the last thing to note is that the Yuki-onna is one of those monsters that only appears under certain conditions most of the time. Of course, the common link is that she always appears when it is snowing, but some stories limit her to only appear when it is snowing on the full moon. In some prefectures of Japan, she is a spirit that only appears around or on New Year's Day, staying around until the beginning of February at the most before disappearing for the rest of the year. Some even have her showing up at the very end of winter as a sort of send-off to the season before spring starts. Like most yokai, there are many different stories about the Yuki-onna. Initial stories about her paint the spirit as malicious, although over time her portrayal becomes more nuanced and we get a variety of interesting takes on her story. I focused on these in here because a lot of the stories do boil down to someone meets the Yuki-onna and then is killed violently. The first written account of the Yuki-onna comes from around the 14th or 15th century from a monk called Sogi. His story is fairly simple. He writes about walking out in his garden one morning and seeing the Yuki-onna there, and when he attempted to speak with her, she vanished. In this tale, the Yuki-onna is said to only appear after heavy snow, which makes her appearance mysterious given it is sent right before it is about to turn to spring. Linking back to the full moon, another story from the Yamagata prefecture shows that the Yuki-onna is actually a princess of the moon that came to visit Earth, and unfortunately got stuck. This is why she appears on nights of the full moon, as she laments not being able to go home. She also, in these stories, kidnaps children, as many spirits seem to do. In a handful of prefectures, Yuki-onna is known more specifically as the talking snow woman, and she presents one of those classic yokai situations where both of the obvious choices just have f***ing awful consequences for you. Depending on the prefecture, you need to proceed in a specific manner. In the Akita and Fukui prefectures, the Yuki-onna attacks if you respond to her greeting. But in the Fukushima and Ibaraki prefectures, it is the opposite situation, and the Yuki-onna attacks if you ignore her instead. My favorite part of this, however, is instead of using her icy breath to steal your life force, she just straight up throws you into a ravine. Next, I have a story that some sources cite to the Yuki-onna, and that others cite to the tsurara-onna, the icicle woman I mentioned earlier. In this story, we have a married couple, a man who loves to take a nice, long, warm bath every night, but his wife always refuses to bathe. He, of course, was confused by this, as who doesn't love a nice hot soak up in that dirty girl soup?
Ah! But the dirty girl soup got me hungry for more of a man.
On a particularly cold night, out of concern for his lovely wife potentially freezing to death, he absolutely insists that she take a bath. Not even with him, he just wants her to stay warm, and she eventually agrees. When the husband returns some minutes later to check on her, all that is left is a puddle on the surface of the bath. In stories with the tsurara-onna, this puddle is replaced by half-melted icicles instead. In many stories, the Yuki-onna is paired up with another yokai, the yukinko, translated as the snow child, which presents another new way for the Yuki-onna to find victims. In these stories, the Yuki-onna is carried the yukinko, which looks just like a normal baby wrapped up in heavy bundled clothing. She will approach travelers and beg them to hold her child for a moment, and if they helpfully oblige, the child will grow heavier and heavier, holding the victim in place until there was enough time for snow to quickly accumulate around them, causing them to freeze to death. One story features a samurai who, having heard the tales of the Yuki-onna before, puts a dagger in his mouth, pointing it towards the child as he holds it. Eventually, he gives the child back to its mother, and the Yuki-onna is actually super grateful, thanking him for his help and showering treasures upon him. Sure, I guess. Finally, the best-known story of the Yuki-onna is probably this next one from 1904, translated by Lafcadio Kern in Kawaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things. In this story, two loggers, a father and son named Mosaku and Minokichi, were caught in a snowstorm. They find an abandoned cabin to stay in, and during the night, Minokichi wakes up to see a beautiful woman leaning over his father, siphoning out his life force with her breath. She spares Minokichi, however, because she finds him beautiful and young, though she forces him to promise that he will never tell the story of this encounter to another living person. She melts away, and sometime later, a beautiful woman named Yuki appears at Minokichi's door looking for shelter from the cold. They fall in love, get married,
And got busy!
have 10 kids. Happy ending, or so it seems. One night, the man remembers the story of what happened to him, and, breaking his promise, tells his wife about the encounter with the Yuki-onna. But, twist! His wife Yuki reveals that she is the Yuki-onna, and in most versions of the tale becomes enraged with the fact that Minokichi has broken his promise. She spares him only because they have children together, but she leaves never to be seen again. A slightly kinder version of the tale has the Yuki-onna look past this broken promise, given she told Minokichi to not tell another living person about her, and technically she's a snow spirit, not another living person, so he hasn't broken his promise. I love a good loophole.
That's the best kind of hole!
Hearn's version is interesting because it absolutely changes the tone of Yuki-onna stories that are written after this point. It is likely some of the story is his own additions, especially because it is a translation of a story that has no source attributed to it. Modern Yuki-onna tales always have some level of melancholy to them, which, to be fair, is a very interesting angle when you compare it to if you meet this woman, you die. Now, there are so many different versions of the story that if I tried to collect and read them all, I'd be here for ages, letting snow accumulate around me until I froze to death. So we're going to move on to our next section. The big question, therefore, is where these stories seem to all stem from originally. Tracing back why a story may have originated seems to be particularly difficult when it comes to yokai, at least from the sources that I've been using. I do think, however, that the Yuki-onna has a very simple explanation. This is in part my personal theory, but a couple sources did seem to agree with this sentiment. I think that stories of the Yuki-onna very simply existed for the same reason many folk tales do, as a cautionary tale. So many scary stories across the world exist to scare kids into not doing something dangerous, or perceived as dangerous. With the Yuki-onna, especially with the stories that cite that she comes out after a blizzard, the moral is clear. It is telling children to not going out wandering in the snow. People would go disappearing because of the harsh conditions out in the wilderness, and the stories, therefore, would be twofold. A warning to children to not go out, for they might fall victim to the Yuki-onna, or a rationalization of what happened to someone who disappeared in the wilderness, likely to a much sadder and more sinister fate. Another interesting theory is the explanation for why the Yuki-onna is described as a beautiful woman. This is the fact that hypothermia victims will often feel like they are overheating and thus take all of their clothes off, which of course leads to them dying faster. You see where I'm going with this, right? A beautiful woman, someone out found dead naked in the snow. Hell of a way to go out. As a particularly well-known yokai, there are plenty of examples of the Yuki-onna in media, far too many for me to mention, so let's outline a few that I found interesting now. Now, I think the obvious first mention is the movie Kwaidan, which is a Japanese horror anthology film that, as you may guess, is an adaptation of a handful of the stories from Lafcadio Hearn's translations. It seems to be fairly faithful to his version of the story, give or take some minor details such as how Minokichi meets his wife, and we get an added note that I think is interesting of the other townsfolk commenting on how Yuki never seems to age, staying just as beautiful as ever. Minokichi's mother also apparently adores Yuki, which is stated to be something that stands out quite a lot, the mother-in-law loving the wife as much as she does. I really like the shot where Minokichi draws the connection between his wife and the Yuki-onna, and this is displayed as something just as simple as a dramatic lighting change for the entire scene. There's not really much else to say here, but it's a really good adaptation of the story that feels executed just the way it needs to. I think it only being an anthology segment is also really perfect. This story wouldn't work as well if it were drawn out in a longer movie. However, to circle back to something that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I think that the most prominent depiction of the Yuki-onna that most people would recognize is the Pokemon Frostlass. Frostlass is an ice and ghost Pokemon introduced in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl as an alternate, female-only evolution to the Pokemon Snorunt, which was introduced in the previous generation of games. Snorunt is likely based on the Yukinko, so what baffles me very honestly is that Snorunt's original evolution, Glalie, kind of exists at all, because Frostlass seems to be a much more fitting final form for Snorunt. I love Glalie, to be clear, it's one of my favorite ice types, but Frostlass just makes more sense. Most of Frostlass's Pokédex entries prove this connection almost directly, and they can often be found in the collections of really creepy Pokédex entries because they directly reference this myth. It freezes foes with an icy breath nearly -60 degrees Fahrenheit. What seems to be its body is actually hollow. The soul of a woman lost on a snowy mountain possessed an icicle, becoming this Pokemon. The food it most relishes is the souls of men. It freezes hikers who have come to climb snowy mountains and carries them back to its home. It only goes after men it thinks are handsome. The Yuki-onna being explained away as a Pokemon is a really fun take on the story, and Frostlass's design incorporating the kimono and being female only really makes it great. Pokemon Legends Arceus also plays into the Yuki-onna stories even more with an entire side quest, implying that there was a trainer who married a likely disguised Frostlass and the ramifications of that. Lesser-known monster taming series, the Yōkai Watch, also features a creature based off the Yuki-onna, and given that it is, well, Yōkai Watch, who's surprised? In this case, we have Frostina and Blizzaria. I don't know the series super well, but it seems to be a yokai that is playable in almost all, if not all, of the games, and it's classified as being part of the Charming tribe and having the Ice attribute. It does seem to be a little simplified down for a younger audience, however, unlike the fairly dark background of the Pokemon Frostlass. In Magic the Gathering, the Yuki-onna is part of a cycle of other onna cards from the Japanese-inspired Kamigawa plane, one of each color. All of them have some sort of ability when they enter play, and then they can be bounced back to your hand if you play other spirit cards or other spells. Specifically, the Yuki-onna can destroy an artifact when it's bounced, which is on theme for its color, but not really on theme for the Yuki-onna. My best guess is that red mana does come from mountain lands, but honestly, I'm just happy it's in the game at all. While we're talking card games, Yu-Gi-Oh! Also has multiple cards featuring the Yuki-onna, including Mischief of the Yokai, Ghost Trick Yuki-onna, and several other Mayakashi cards. I don't have the authority to comment on the rules of these though, because I don't actually go to Yu-Gi-Oh! Except for the rare times that I use Pot of Greed to draw 3 additional cards for my deck. Given that the Yuki-onna is of Japanese origin, it's pretty obvious that she would make appearances in a number of anime and other pieces of Japanese media. I cannot get in depth into all of these characters, but I do want to list some notable examples I was able to find. In Bleach, the spirit of one of the main characters, Rukia's sword, is Sode no Shirayuki, or Snow White Sleeves. It is a completely white sword that uses ice in its attacks, and eventually manifests into a form that looks quite a lot like the Yuki-onna. In Rosario and Vampire, an anime about a school literally called Yokai Academy, Mizore is a more humanized teenage Yuki-onna that constantly has a lollipop in her mouth that contains a magical coolant. They refer to her as a snow fairy throughout most of the show, though. Inuyasha features the Yuki-onna as an antagonist in episode 101, who spends her time doing normal Yuki-onna things, like seducing and freezing men for fun and profit. This tale is played fairly straight while fitting in the universe of Inuyasha, although this Yuki-onna can summon snow leopards, which is pretty cool. And of course I have to mention Ghost Stories, everyone's favorite irreverent anime dub. Episode 17's ghost is a girl who drowned in a lake up in the snowy mountains, helpfully named Yuki for those of us who are in the know. She appears as human for most of the episode before her ruse to try and kill her sister, who she claims is the ghost, is discovered, and then in true Ghost Stories AVD dub fashion, she is put to spiritual sleep in the most absurd way possible.
We go with the snow, but not the snow that is yellow. We go with the snow. Is she dead yet?
There, of course, are plenty of other anime featuring the Yuki-onna, such as Ranma 1.5, Powerpuff Girls Z, Yu Yu Hakusho, Urusei Yatsura, Monster Musume, and many, many more, and I apologize for any names that I butchered in that last segment. Pathfinder, my beloved tabletop role-playing game, includes the Yuki-onna in 1st edition's Bestiary 3. In this setting, she is the spirit of a woman who froze to death in the snow and was never given a proper burial, having become a lawful evil undead. This Yuki-onna doesn't siphon out life essence, but she can deal cold damage and cast some cold magic, and magically generates a blizzard to surround her. Appropriately, they are vulnerable to fire damage, and sit at around a challenge rating of 8. As usual, I'm really impressed with the breadth of legends that Pathfinder has worked into their bestiaries. One of the many transformations in the game, Yume Nikki, that Medatsuki can collect is the Yuki-onna. It doesn't do very much aside from creating a snow effect, but Yume Nikki is really a game mostly about vibes anyways, so I'm just happy seeing it here. If there's a favorite Yuki-onna in media that you like that I missed, let me know about it in the comments. I can never cover everything, and I'm pretty sure I missed some really cool interpretations of her. Pun intended, only if you want it to be. Getting to explore another area of folktales that I was not as familiar with as Greek mythology or cryptozoology in general was a lot of fun. I cannot wait to tackle more yokai in the future. There's a well of cool monsters that realistically will never dry up. Next episode, we'll be moving all the way west and covering our first American monster, Latin America to be precise, as I go over the Aztec and Maya myths of the god Quetzalcoatl. Very excited for this one, I cannot wait. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, please throw me a like or a subscribe, it helps me so much. If there are any monsters that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. What do you think of the Yuki-onna? What would you do if a hot ghost appeared in a cold place? Write a 2 to 5 sentence discussion post and respond to 2 others. Also, I am taking suggestions and would love to see what people want to learn about. But until next time, I'm Mothmancha, and remember, when in snow, do as the snowmen do.